to hear about what is going on around us and what is going on and what you have said in your word. Lord, I pray that you will help open up our hearts, open up our ears, open up our minds for the teaching today. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. You may all be seated.
Okay, tonight's lesson is going to be on the end time prophecies in the book of Daniel. There are 12 chapters altogether, and 6 of them contain end time prophecy. We're going to be starting with chapter 2, and that's the chapter where Nebuchadnezzar has the dream about the statue. The statue has 5 sections in it, and each of those sections represents a world empire. It starts off with Nebuchadnezzar's head of gold. That's the Babylonian Empire. And after that is the Mede and Persian Empire. That was represented by the section of silver. Then came the brass section, which was Alexander the Great's Grecian Empire. The Roman Empire was next. That's the empire that was in power when Jesus came the first time. That was represented by the legs of iron. And then the last section of the statue, which is the one that most prophecy teachers miss, was the feet and toes that were iron mingled with clay. And that was a representation of the Holy Roman Empire. That empire was always ruled by a political leader and whoever was pope at the time. Now that empire, because there were 2 leaders, there was a lot of conflict. And since you had 2, there was no tiebreaker. And so that empire tended to rise and fall many times through its history. The last time, it started in 800 AD. The last time it fell was at the beginning of the 1800s. And it is rising now again. It took a big leap forward with the Lisbon Treaty in 2009. And if you want to know more about that, you can read about it online. Now, in the end, as this empire is rising again, it will again be ruled by 2 leaders, just like before. The political leader will be the Antichrist. And then whoever is pope at the time will rule with him. And the Bible calls that person the false prophet. Now, the verses are on your handout sheet. If you look at verse 34 and 35 of this second chapter, it goes on to tell a little more of what happened in the dream. There was a stone that came down. It hit the statue on the feet. It didn't hit in a different place in the statue. It hit the feet because that is symbolic of Jesus returning, and he's taking down human governments. It hits the feet because the human government that will be in power at that time is the Holy Roman Empire. So that's why it hits the feet instead of somewhere else on the statue. But it then goes on to say that that stone grows and fills the earth, and that is him setting up his millennial kingdom, which will rule over the world after that. Now, in verse 44, it says, in the days of these kings, again, we're talking still about the Holy Roman Empire. It says, in the days of these kings shall the God of heaven set up a kingdom. This gives us a time frame. And when it says these kings, it's specifically referring to the 10 kings that are represented by the toes of the statue. And we will also hear about those again, depicted just a little bit differently in the next chapter that we go over. But this verse 44 then is letting us know that this kingdom will be in power at the time that Jesus returns. Now, moving on to chapter 7, this is the chapter where Daniel sees a vision of 4 beasts coming up out of the sea. Now, these beasts are the ones that represent modern-day nations. And before I get into what these beasts are, I want to take you to a few different verses that give us a little added information. The first verse being verse 17. In that verse, it lets us know that these beasts represent kings or rulers of the nations. Then in verse 23, it says the 4th beast is the 4th kingdom. So these 2 verses let us know that when you're reading Bible prophecy and it mentions a beast, it not only is talking about the ruler of that nation, but it's also talking about the nation that ruler is over. Sometimes, especially in the book of Revelation, when it talks about the beast, it will be talking about the Antichrist, the ruler. Other times, it's talking about his world government that he rules over. And then again, there's other times when it's referring to both at the same time. So if you keep that in mind, it'll clear up a lot of confusion. Now, also, one other scripture that I wanted to point out is verse 9. It says that Daniel watched till the thrones were cast down, and that's the depiction again of Jesus casting down human governments, and the Ancient of Days did sit. And the Ancient of Days is Jesus. So this is him setting up his kingdom, and he's sitting now on the throne. Now, this lets us know again that these nations will be on earth when Jesus returns. So we know that these are modern nations. They're not nations that existed back in ancient history and are no longer around. So we need to keep that in mind as we look at each of these beasts. So starting with the first beast, the first one was a lion with eagle's wings. Now, thinking of modern nations today, the lion is mostly known for the symbol of Great Britain. Now, there are other nations that have a lion within their symbology, but Great Britain's the most prominent. And as we read some details about this lion and the eagle's wings that are growing out of it, we'll be able to pin down exactly who these 2 nations are. The eagle's wings represents the United States. And again, there are other nations that have an eagle as their symbol. I think there's about 7 of them, if I remember right. But again, we have to look at the details given that will help us pin this down. So Daniel goes on to tell us 3 things about the eagle. He says that the eagle's wings were plucked away from the lion. That's the first one. Then he says they were made to stand up like a man. That's the second. And then he said that a man's heart was given to it. So that's the third clue. Okay, so now we have to think about which lion country and which eagle country does this fit? If you use Great Britain as the lion, then the United States is the eagle. It's a perfect fit, and there are no other nations on the earth today that fits the clues. So the first thing that he said was that the wings were plucked away from the lion. So this is a depiction of the United States coming out of Great Britain and becoming its own nation. It's no longer connected with Great Britain. So the eagle becomes separated from the lion, and they are now their own 2 separate nations. And then it says that they were made to stand up like a man. We have a second symbol, And it's not talked about very much anymore, but it was very prominent in the past, and that's Uncle Sam. When I was a little girl, you would see posters and pictures everywhere of Uncle Sam, talked about a lot. And then it goes on to say that a man's heart was given to it. And that is unique to the United States. When other nations defeat an enemy, they will plunder that nation and leave them bankrupt and walk away. The United States doesn't do that. If you look into the United States history, when we defeat a nation, we always come back and help that nation get back on their feet. And that's where the man's heart comes in. Now, if you take those clues, you can easily see that this is Great Britain with the United States coming out of it. We fought the British in the Revolutionary War. We won that war. We declared our independence from Great Britain. There are no other nations that fits those clues. So we know without a doubt that this is talking about Great Britain and the United States. Now, the second beast was a bear. And the bear is the symbol for Russia. It tells us that the bear had 3 ribs in its mouth. Now, we don't know for positive what those ribs are about, but there has been speculation that it could be referring to the 3 Baltic nations that used to belong to Russia, that perhaps at some point Russia will take them back again. And we are in a scenario in the world today with the war that's going on where those 3 nations are building bunkers because they expect a war with Russia. So it is possible we may see this fulfilled. It also said that the bear raises itself up on one side, and Russia has always conquered from the European side. Then it goes on to say that Daniel heard a voice that said, "Arise, devour much flesh." And if you go into communist Russia's history, you'll find that they have killed more than 60 million people. So all the clues fit for Russia. The third beast was a leopard with 4 heads, and that is a depiction of Germany. Now, the leopard, mostly today we associate Germany with a leopard through their military tanks, the Leopard 1 and the Leopard 2. They are world famous. Most countries buy their tanks from Germany because they are so well made. So they're very much known for those Leopard tanks. There used to be, and I'm going to go ahead and tell you about this, although you can't get online and verify it anymore, but there used to be an old Webster dictionary online, and under the topic of the leopard, it told in there that it was an alternate symbol for Germany. Now, the 4 heads on this leopard represented the 4 kingdoms of Germany. The word Reich is a German word for kingdom. And there was the first, second, Hitler's Third Reich. The Fourth Reich is now rising. Now, the leopard also had wings. The wings on the leopard were the wings of a fowl. And a fowl is a certain type of bird, such as a chicken or a rooster. And that's a representation of the Franco-German alliance. France's symbol is the rooster. It also tells us that the lion or the leopard was given dominion. And Germany has always been the dominant nation in Europe. Now, the 4th beast was a little bit different from the others because it wasn't a single nation. It's a group of nations, and this is again a representation of the Holy Roman Empire. Daniel said that the beast was different from all the others. He also said that it was exceedingly strong, and he pointed out that it had 10 horns. Now these are where we come back to those 10 toes on the statue again. If you go to verse 24, it says that the 10 horns are 10 kings. So that's where we kind of get our verification that those 10 toes are 10 kings also. In verse 8, Daniel saw a little horn come up among the 10. Now, anytime that you read about the little horn in prophecy, it's always talking about the Antichrist. And that little horn comes up among the 10, and it says that it plucks up 3. In another verse, it says it subdues 3. Now, I don't know exactly what it is that happens to those 3, so I don't really have a big explanation for that. But it appears that the 10 reduced down to 7 plus the Antichrist. He goes on to say that this little horn had eyes like a man and spoke great things. Now, there's another depiction of this in Revelation chapter 17. It talks about the 10 kings there also. There's some sort of an alliance of some kind that that has power that the Antichrist gives them for, it says, 1 hour. We don't believe that to be 60 minutes. We believe that to be just a short period of time. Now, this happens at the end of the tribulation, or it may be toward the end, but for sure it's happening into the days after the tribulation is over. And we know that because it goes on to say that they make war with the Lamb. And that would be when Jesus returns to finish the Battle of Armageddon. So it's probably that interval when the Armageddon War is going on, that this alliance has their power with the Antichrist. I have speculated myself that it could be some of the top generals of the armies that are coming against Israel, with Russia being the main one. Now, before I go on to our next chapter, I have just a side note I wanted to go over with you. In the book of Daniel, in the 7th chapter, these beasts are separate. They're each separate nations. But when you go to Revelation 13, John sees the same thing. He sees a beast coming up out of the sea, just like Daniel saw them coming up out of the sea. But this time there's one beast. They have all merged together into one. It's got the 7 heads from all these other beasts. It has the body of the leopard, the feet of the bear, the mouth of the lion. They're all in there, but they've merged together, and this represents the world government. Now, the one thing that you might notice when you read about those beasts that are merged together, it does not mention the wings of the fowl, which is France. However, they were never plucked away from the leopard. So they are looked upon as still being attached. So when it tells us the leopard is there, we automatically believe that France is there. If they're not, we don't know what happened to France. Now, the one thing that isn't there is the eagle. The eagle's wings was separated and became its own nation, and it is not named in that merged beast. But if you go to the chapter right before that, chapter 12, we find the eagle's wings there. They are given to Israel to help her throughout the tribulation years. And of course, the United States has always been there for Israel ever since they became a nation. So we will be there again for Israel during the tribulation. Now, we're going to go on now to chapter 8. This chapter starts out telling about Alexander the Great. I'm not going to get into a lot of the details with it. It isn't pertinent to the end-time prophecy, but it just tells about him and how he defeated the Medes and the Persians, and had his Grecian Empire then at that point. Now, if you know your history, you know that he had conquered all the known world by the time he was 30 years old, and he died 2 years later. In verse 9, it tells us again about a little horn. We're talking again about the Antichrist here. It says that a little horn came up among one of the areas. The Grecian Empire was split up into 4 sections, and one of those would have been in the European area. And this little horn comes up from one of those sections that would have been the Europe area. And we know that this is the Antichrist because we do have a proof text for this one. It's in verse 11. It tells there that he takes away the daily sacrifice. We know that's the Antichrist. So we know that this is who it's talking about. Now, verse 10 is an interesting verse. It tells there that the Antichrist waxes great, even to the host of heaven. Now, the host of heaven is the angels. And it tells there that some of the angels are cast down to the ground. Now, we have another picture of this in Revelation chapter 12. It tells there about the war in heaven where Michael and his angels fight against the dragon, Satan, and his angels. In verse 9, it describes Satan as a red dragon and tells that his tail draws a third of the angels and casts them to the earth. So this is the same depiction of what we just read in Daniel. Now, most people think that this happened 6,000 years ago, but this hasn't happened yet. Satan has not been confined to the earth as yet, nor his angels. They still have access to heaven. They will not be cast down until this point that is right before the tribulation begins. In verse 8 of Revelation 12, it goes on to say that Satan and his angels prevailed not, neither was their place found anymore in heaven. So at that point, they no longer have access to heaven. And it tells then, if we go back, I think, let's see, where am I at? Verse 10, it says that now is come salvation and strength and the kingdom of our God and the power of his Christ. Why? For the accuser of our brethren is cast down, which accused them before God day and night. This is letting us know that power and strength is going to come to God's people like never before once Satan is cast down to the earth. And that's why Daniel tells us in chapter 11 that the people that do know their God will be strong and do exploits. Now, chapter 9 is the chapter where the angel Gabriel comes to Daniel and he tells him about a prophecy about God dealing with Israel for a 70-week period of time. Now, this is not 7 days weeks. This is 7 years weeks, and so it comes out to be 490 years. Now, these years are split up into 3 sections. The first 2 are the longest. There's a small gap in between them. And at the end of those 2 sections, you land at 70 AD. Now, there is another gap, but this one is much larger. This one is like around 2,000 years. And in that gap, God is dealing with the Gentiles, taking out a people for his name's sake. Then we come back to the last section. It's the last 7 years where God is turning and dealing with Israel once again. And that final 7 years begins with the confirmation of the covenant. Now, this chapter goes on to talk about that, But since I talked about the confirmation of the covenant in my last lesson, I'm not going to go into that tonight just for the sake of saving some time. But if you go on the church's YouTube page under the playlists, you will find several different playlists. One of them is named Prophecy. And if you click on that, it will take you to all my most recent lessons. And you can go back to that last one then and cover the details about the confirmation of the covenant again. Now we'll move on here to chapter 11. In this chapter, the first 20 verses is a saga about the kings of the north versus the kings of the south. And this covers approximately 2,000 years. Actually, I think it's a little more than that. And if you know your history well, you can pick out Alexander the Great in there, and you may even be able to pick out Hitler in there. Now, Brother Baxter was an expert on history, but he said he even had trouble figuring out who all of them were. So some of it is just doesn't give quite enough detail to get them all picked out. Now, starting in verse 21 of that chapter, that's what we want to look at from chapter 20, or from verse 21 on through to the end of the chapter, because that is now going to talk about the Antichrist and the final 7 years. It starts out by telling us that the Antichrist is a vile person. It also calls him the Prince of the Covenant. It tells that they do not give him the honor of the kingdom, but he obtains it by flatteries. So he's going to be a smooth-talking person that everybody's going to want to listen to. And the kingdom that's being talked about there is the Holy Roman Empire. Now, there's a lot of stuff in these last verses of this chapter, and I'm not going to go through one by one because it would take too long, but I'm just going to kind of give you the highlights of it. As you read through here, those first verses from 21 on down through 30, you're in the years prior to the tribulation. And you'll notice as you read along and you're reading some specific things about the Antichrist in there, he becomes more and more aggravated with Israel. It starts out at the beginning where he confirms the covenant. But then later on it says he has indignation against the covenant. And then it says that he has intelligence with those who forsake the covenant. So it's like he's progressively getting worse. And I think what is going on there is once Satan is cast down to the earth, he very well may take possession of the Antichrist at that point. I think he's controlling him prior to that, kind of maneuvering him. But I don't know if he actually is possessing him until he has been confined to the earth. That's a little bit of speculation, but it's a possibility. Now, the ones who forsake the covenant are possibly apostate Jews. In Israel today, there are Jews who are willing to give land to the Palestinians. They are also willing to divide Jerusalem. So it could be people like that he's having this intelligence with. Now, when you reach verse 31, that's our dividing line for the final 7 years. In that verse, it tells about the abomination of desolation and the taking away of the daily sacrifice. That's what happens just as the tribulation is ready to begin. And so that puts us right at the start of the tribulation years. Now, the thing to remember is from verse 31 onward to the end of the chapter, we are in the tribulation years. That's really important to remember that when you're reading these verses. Now, verse 32, the very next verse, is the one where he says, the people that do know their God will be strong and do exploits. Then he goes on to say that those that understand among the people will instruct many. So while the Antichrist is establishing his empire, there's going to be a great revival going on. And you've heard me talk about that before. At the same time, there will be persecution against the Jews and against the Christians. However, that persecution will be more severe in some places than it will be in other places. Now, as you get into verse 41, you're going to find that many countries are being overthrown by the Antichrist. However, it tells us there that Edom, Moab, and the children of Ammon escape out of his hand. And those are all places in Jordan. So Jordan never does come under his authority. We also know that Israel never does, because if they did, well, you wouldn't need the Armageddon War. And then the United States would be another, because if we are helping Israel throughout the tribulation years, we're not going to be following the Antichrist and be under his rule at the same time. That wouldn't make any sense. Now, there's probably others. The Bible doesn't name them specifically or give us any specific clues about who they may be. However, if you look closely at verse 40 and verse 41, or no, 44, 40 and 44, those are two different wars that the Antichrist is fighting. And remember, this is during the tribulation years. So he has opposition coming from somewhere else in these two wars. Now, the end of the chapter, it ends by saying that he shall come to his end and none shall help him. Now, when we go on to the last chapter, chapter 12, it jumps back in time a little bit. The book of Daniel, as well as the book of Revelation, are not written in chronological order. They kind of jump back and forth as you go through the books. And this chapter 12 jumps us back to the beginning of the tribulation. Actually, it's slightly before it begins. And it talks in that first verse about Michael and that war that's going on in heaven. And it says that at that time Michael will stand up, the great prince that stands for the children of thy people, and there shall be a time of trouble such as never was since there was a nation. So this is where the tribulation years are beginning. Now verse 2 is a little bit of a tricky verse if you don't know a lot of your other scriptures that go along with it. This is one of those ones that you have to pull in some other scriptures to get a proper understanding of it. Because this verse says, and many of them that sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt. Now, just reading that on the surface with no other scriptures involved, it sounds like all of the dead will be raised at the rapture. But that is not the case. There's a 1,000-year difference between the ones that are raised at the rapture and the ones that are raised later on. We know from one of the other scriptures, and I forget where this is at right off the top of my head, but it says the dead in Christ will rise. Now that's the saved dead. So we're not talking about the ones who it says are raised to shame and everlasting contempt. We're talking about the ones that are raised to everlasting life. Now the scripture verse that is the most helpful in understanding this is when you go to chapter 20 of Revelation, verses 4 and 5. Because it's in those verses where John is talking about the people that didn't worship the beast, the ones who are living and reigning with Christ for 1,000 years, and he calls that the first resurrection. So there's more than one resurrection. He goes on then to explain that the rest of the dead are not raised until the 1,000-year millennium is over. So there's actually two resurrections. So don't let that verse 2 there throw you off. Going on to verses 5 through 7, that's where it tells about the angel that stood on the water declaring that the end of the age was at hand. And there is another scripture that says about the same thing. You can cross-reference this in Revelation 10, verses 5 and 6. Then going on to verses 8 and 9, this is where Daniel does not understand what he's been writing about, and he asks God about it. And the Lord says to him, "Go thy way, Daniel, for the words are closed up and sealed till the time of the end." Now in verse 10 it tells us that none of the wicked will understand, but the wise shall understand. Now the wise being the people that are living for God, know their prophecies and all of that, they're going to understand what's going on. And we'll be reaching people who love the Lord, they're trying to live for God, but they were thinking they'd already be raptured. And, you know, Brother Baxter used to say, don't worry about it right now, because pretty soon events are going to overtake their theology. And at that point, we'll be able to talk to them and they'll start listening because they realize somewhere they missed something. And so the wise will understand. But the ones that we're never going to be able to reach, the ones that their heart is closed and they're never going to come to God, those are the ones that are referred to as the wicked, and they will never understand. They will go on to take the mark of the beast and not give it a second thought. Now, the last thing that Daniel says at the close of his book, and this is in verses 11 and 12, he says, "From the time that the daily sacrifice shall be taken away, and the abomination that makes desolate is set up, there shall be 1,290 days. Blessed is he that waits and comes to the 1,335th day." Now, this is a little bit of a puzzle, because there are no other scriptures in the Bible that gives us information about these two numbers. But we have a plausible explanation. First of all, the tribulation years, there are two scriptures in the Bible that tells us the exact number of days that the tribulation, how long it is, how many days long. And that is 1,260 days. So this first number that Daniel gave is actually 30 more extra days. And if you go back and read that verse, it says, "From the time the daily sacrifice shall be taken away, and the abomination that makes desolate is set up." That gives a little bit of an indication that there may be a time interval there. And a possible scenario of that would be if the Antichrist goes and he stops Israel from doing their sacrifices. He may tell them at that point, "You know, I've got a big announcement coming in 30 days, and you will understand why I'm doing this at that point." And when it says in there that the abomination that makes desolate is set up, my thinking, and this is just me, is, you know, if you're going to make a worldwide announcement in our day and age, you got to get all the media there and get everything set up and ready for it, because you want the whole world to hear what you have to say. So that could very well be what that extra 30-day interval is there. So you'd have your 30 days, then you'd have your tribulation years, which would be that 1,260 days. That brings us up to the 1,290 days that Daniel talked about. Then, at the end, we have that other number that gives us an additional 45 days. Now, that is very possibly during the time that when the tribulation has ended, we've got the Armageddon War going on. The Lord is returning at that point at the end of it, and then is the dawning of the millennial kingdom. And blessed is he that makes it to that day. So that's the best we can do on those numbers. Okay, that's what I have for tonight. This will be the last lesson for now. Do you have any questions on anything I covered tonight?
You mentioned talking about the three ribs in Russia's mouth. You mentioned the Baltic
Nations, yeah.
Do you happen to know what those Baltic nations?
Oh, let's see. Gina, can you help me on that? Estonia, Latvia, and what's the other one?
Serbia.
No, not Serbia.
Lithuania.
Lithuania is the other one. Okay, yeah, those three. See, some of those Baltic nations right now are building bunkers. You know, they're right on the border with Russia. They used to be a part of Russia. Now they're a part of the European Union. And it could be that if Russia ends up attacking in Europe, which they're getting prepared for that right now, possibly in the end they will have those nations back again. If that's not what it is, we don't know what those three ribs are. Maybe we'll find out as time goes on. Okay, any other questions, Leah?
Okay, so the last time we talked about the Antichrist, well, it was a while back. You did have someone that there was a chance it was going to be them. I don't think it's them anymore, but do you know, like, is there any, like, anybody that people are looking at and they're like, this could be the Antichrist? We gotta wait it out?
Well, you know, I think the last one that we talked about, see, Brother Baxter used to think Gorbachev could possibly be the one. But then he got old and, you know, time passed. The most recent one was the one that's the head of France, Emmanuel Macron. There's still that possibility. We don't know yet at this point. So time will tell. Okay. All right, if there's no other questions. Oh, Gina? Let's see.
The 2000, the very end of Daniel's where she's talking about.
It says days in there, doesn't it?
Yes, but sometimes when it says days,
Well, this says days, and where it talks, in the two scriptures where it talks about the number of days for the tribulation, that also says days. And those are actual days, because that comes out to the 3.5 years.
I think when it says weeks is where it doesn't literally mean a week as we know.
Yeah, the weeks, the 70 weeks, that was the one where when it talks about a week, it's not talking about 7 days, it's talking about 7 years for each week. So maybe that helps.
Where the day is different because even in Genesis chapter 1, it says the evening and the morning were the first day.
That's true.
So when it's talking about literal days as opposed to the day of the Lord, which would mean a time period
Yeah.
or something, right?
Yeah, I think that would be correct.
I can't, there doesn't mean there isn't any, I can't think of any right now.
Okay. All right, if that's it, then I guess we are done.